Today I am here with my friend, Mama Zan Tyler. Hi, Zan.
Hey, Ro, it's so good to be here with you today.
It is my absolute pleasure. I know that I could talk to you for 2, 3 hours on so many different topics, and I'm just really excited that we get this time together because today we're going to be talking about freedom and allowing you to share your story of homeschooling and where you are today. So thanks for being on the show.
Oh, my goodness. It is my pleasure and privilege.
Thank you. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about freedom. And if Zan just does a flip of her hair, you will see her fabulous
Yes,
earrings.
my
And
freedom earrings. I've got on my stars and my stripes.
yes, the outfit was intentional. It was not a mistake. So, we have to call that out. You look fabulous.
Thank you.
All right. So, Zan, you know, in the homeschool world, there are different types of moms. There's the reluctant homeschool mom who's like, you're going to have to tie me up and force me to do this. And there's a mom who, when she was 5, she knew that she wanted to be a mom who was homeschooling, right? Where do you
Right.
fall in that category?
Well, I'll tell you this. When I was in college, there were two things I said I would never do: teach or have kids. And so my life is instructive in so many different ways.
Mhm.
I'm glad God had another plan for my life. It was so much more interesting and exciting than the one I had planned. I just was planning to go to law school after college. I was very intentional about my education as been proposed our junior year in college. And so, as I say, he co opted my life and or hijacked it, but I'm so glad he did because the 3 years I would have been in law school, I had two little boys.
Aw. So sweet. And
and,
yeah.
so
No, I was going to say, and I definitely want to talk about those boys, especially John, because you have a story that's so inspiring. So, talk to me about what led you to the homeschooling world, because clearly this was not your vision. You were not planning to homeschool, but here you are, a successful veteran who homeschooled. How did that happen?
Well, it was interesting because when we were in college, there was a speaker who came to our campus. We were at a pretty liberal college, and this was our campus crusade Sunday night thing where we would have hundreds of kids in a campus with 2,000 people. And he said, if Christian parents in the church would be intentional about discipling their own children, what a difference it would make. And it was one of these things where he had a calculation about how much it would speed up the fulfillment of the Great Commission and all of that. But the thing that stuck with Joe was our main goal as parents is to disciple our children to love Christ. And we were very committed to the family early on, hence our two boys the first 3 years we were married. But we had never, this is the early 80s, we had never even heard of homeschooling. So Ty's in a church kindergarten, my oldest son, and he's the only one not reading, which, I mean, he was a totally brilliant child. I mean, so many areas of brilliance in his life. And he just wasn't ready to read. And now I know how common that is. But then you would have thought it was an act of Congress. A friend of mine, because I was committed to not knowing anything about education. And so a friend of mine who had her master's said, Zan, you just need to hold Ty back a year. So I had him tested like she suggested and took the test scores to the school district. And they said, oh, yeah, you can hold Ty back. This was in May. Well, in July, they changed their mind and said, you can't hold him back and put him in our first grade. Well, by then, public schools were filled. And another friend of mine who I used to meet with once a week for prayer and Bible study, she's probably 5 or 10 years older than me, but had a son that was younger than my boys. And she said, Zan, I taught in public schools. I'm homeschooling Nat, and you should homeschool Ty. And it was the first time I had heard of that concept. I knew there were some people in the backwoods in Mississippi who were homeschooling and bartering, but no, they didn't even use money. That didn't count. And I thought, oh Lord, help me, Jesus. I cannot do this. And I just
Mhm.
remember her saying that. And they were getting their master's degrees at Columbia Bible College to go on the mission field. And so they lived in a little mobile home while they were doing that. And I just thought, oh, these walls are closing in on me. It was like Star Wars, where they were in the trash compactor and the walls are closing in. I thought, I got to get out of here. And so all the way home, she gave me a book, Homegrown Kids by Raymond Moore. But all the way home, I was giving the Lord all the reasons I will not homeschool. I will not homeschool. I will never homeschool. This is why. And I'm talking out loud. I'm sure my kids thought I had lost. And but I got home and I read the book as a courtesy to Susan. And I was just totally enamored with the thought that you could have a supportive education for your children tailored to them and their needs at home. But it was 1984. I mean, Ro, we knew nobody in the world who homeschooled,
Yeah.
not one person. And I just thought, I can't do this to my kids. I can't do this to my parents. I mean, I just had this list of good reasons why I should not homeschool. And then the school district sort of forced our hand when they said, well, you can't hold a year. We've changed our mind. Private schools were filled. And so I said, well, I guess I'll just have to homeschool then. And it was really more of a, not a veiled threat. I don't mean threat, but I knew when I used the word homeschool, they'd say, oh, yeah, 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 we'll hold him back. And
Right.
they said, oh, the school district's gotten lenient with that kind of thing. What they didn't tell me was they had approved one person in the history of the district to homeschool, and she was a certified teacher. So all of that is just a long story to say we, we were very surprised and shocked by the fact that God was calling us to homeschool. And I feel like He closed other doors along the way to lead us into homeschooling when it wasn't that I wasn't willing. I was really, it was very daunting then. And I was afraid of the consequences.
Yeah.
And, as I got more and more into it, I realized, I was right to be afraid.
Oh, wow.
And so the school board turned us down, and we had not told either set of our parents we were homeschooling. And I just had this brainstorm in the middle of the summer. I should go see the state superintendent of education because my mother had been a public school teacher. He was a friend of my mother's. And while he was getting his PhD, he actually observed my mom's classroom. So I would see him every afternoon after school. So I called Dr. Williams. I said, Dr. Williams, I have a problem. Can I come see you? He said, sure, honey, come on up. He said, can you come now? I'll clear my calendar. I mean, I was talking to a friend
Yeah.
and my mom's friend. And so I go down there and I'm expecting when he hears my story for him to saying, you are a mom who loves your kids. You want to do the best for them. Let me help you solve this problem. Instead, he looked at me and he said, if you continue down this homeschooling path, I will have you put in jail for truancy. And so that's really, this is just how our homeschool journey started. And I just remember saying to him, scripture says that God will give you the words when you're confronted by the authorities. Don't be afraid.
Right.
I laugh and say sometimes you don't know that sometimes you might not like what you're given to say.
Right.
So I just remember saying out loud to him, well, Dr. Williams, you'll just have to put me in jail then. And I'm looking around to see if there was anybody in that room who could
Like, who said that?
did I say that? And so, but it was a defining moment for me. It was really my Patrick Henry moment. And I just said thank you and got up and left. I went and saw my parents. I said, Mom and Dad, I'm homeschooling this year. My dad was an attorney. Dad, here are my legal briefs so far. This is what's happened to me. Mom, I had a pamphlet with some information on homeschooling by Dr. Moore. I said, here's this. Here's the educational research I had, which was zero. And I said, and Charlie Williams has threatened to put me in jail, and my hearing is next week at the State Department of Education. So with that, I sort of left the room quite hysterical at this point, and so that's how we got started.
Zan, every single time I hear your story, it gives me chills for so many reasons. I am a beneficiary of the struggle that you went through, right? Like the fights for freedom that you fought, I'm benefiting from that right now. And even though New Jersey and Pennsylvania has experienced some egregious bills, I cannot imagine what it was like in your place to be someone who was battling this. There were no state organizations saying, hey, I'll come along to support you. Thankfully, there was HSLDA, but there weren't communities and co-ops and like these spaces where you can go to a convention and get rallied up and feel
Mhm.
empowered. This was you talking to who you thought was a family friend And when you said you're Patrick Henry, it's the give me liberty or give me death. And here you
Yeah.
were like, God, I didn't want to say that.
That's right. And I was 27 years old.
Yeah,
It puts it in perspective a little bit.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
Absolutely.
to-
One of the things I thought of when you were speaking is there's so many different themes that happen in your life, and I wonder what you would say to the mom who is thinking, I cannot do this. They feel the call, or maybe they just see the struggles their child is having, and they have that mother's love, and they're thinking that they have to intervene, but they don't feel equipped to do so. What would you say to a mom who is in your story saying, I can't do this, and not only do I feel like I can't do it, I don't want to do it?
right, right. Yes, I would say I have total empathy for you. But as moms, most of us really just would die for our kids, and what is best for them. And so when you see something that is really, is going to benefit your child, you feel like God is calling you to do it and he's going to help you you don't have to feel brave. You just you just have to be brave.
Yeah.
You just kind of just go through the next thing. And I don't think courage is not being afraid. I
Mhm.
think maybe it's feeling that fear and moving forward anyway. I can remember, so HSLDA had started on the West Coast in 1983, but they had not moved to DC. And it's certainly, I mean, Dr. Moore had given me Mike Smith's number at one point, and I talked to him, but it wasn't like there was just no way for them to help us at that point in time.
Oh, wow.
And so we really got hooked in with HSLDA in 1987 a little bit, but a lot of bit in 1988 and 1989.
Oh, wow.
And so I would just tell parents, homeschooling is so good for your children that sometimes you just have to make, I mean, it's an act of the will to lay aside the fear or the reluctance and then go for it, because God gives his grace as you're moving forward. And he's not going to give you, I always had a friend who said God's not going to give you tomorrow's grace today.
Right.
And that was just good for me to hear and be reminded of.
Yeah. And I remember us talking and you sharing stories about you up and down, the courts, talk with your boys. Like, what was it like dragging your kids to the state house and where are they today? Because that's why I mentioned John earlier. What's Ty up to? What was it like during that time? And what are Ty and John up to these days?
It was really interesting because this is the day before internet, email, and all of that. So a lot of times when I was at the state house, you would just have to go down there to talk to somebody, or if somebody didn't want to tell me about a meeting, they wouldn't tell me. I'd have to go down there and find it out. So I'm always getting two little boys dressed to go downtown to the state house and just hang out for a while. So eventually, I had a friend who would help me with the boys some, two friends where the boys could play some days when I was down at the legislature, but mostly they were with me. And, so here are some of the memories I have. I have memories of coming home and sitting in my curriculum closet at night when everybody's in bed and just weeping because we didn't get workbook pages done that day. We'd try to read and do other things, but we certainly didn't get everything done, especially when we had a day long whatever at the state house. And the other thing I remember is just the constancy of it, and them being with me and wondering. I was so happy we just finished a segment of a video with HSLDA, and John was interviewing with me, and he said, really, I just had a normal childhood. I said, I'm just so glad that he remembers the joy and the playing and all those kinds of things. But it was really interesting. There are a couple of memories I have as the boys are getting older now, because and we started at the state house in 85, the before the session in 86. So 85, 86, we started lobbying. And finished in 1992. So that was quite an age, a year span. I can remember once Ty was 10, we were down at the state house together, and they know the ropes by then. They know how to get around. They've discovered the underground tunnels, and we can do that and have a little bit of fun. So we're going up the stairs to lobby, in the lobby of the state house, and we passed this senator. I'm just going to call him Senator Smith. And Ty says, "Well, hey, Senator Smith, how are you?" And he says, "Good, Ty, how are you?" And I looked at Ty and I said, "How do you know him?" He said, "I don't know, Mom. He was my extrovert." And he said, "I just know people. Ty has always just known people." And I said, "Ty, I can't get him to talk to me to tell him about this homeschool bill." So he runs back down the stairs, grabs him by the hand, and said, "Senator Smith, I want you to meet my mama." And so he comes up and he says, "Senator Smith, my mama is so sweet. Why won't you vote for her bill?" And so he said, "Zan, come see me." And so those are the stories that make your heart sing. And and then as the boys got older, they were both collegiate level athletes. I mean, they both were John trained for soccer in college and ended up not playing. Ty played in college. And so but they couldn't play sports in South Carolina at the time in public schools, and there were no homeschool leagues. So one of our senators said, "Well, just let the boys work for me, Zan." Usually that's a college level thing. But so Ty worked for Senator Gazay for 2 years, and John worked for Senator Gazay for 2 years while they were in high school. So they just really had a wealth of experience. And they grew up in the courtroom with me. Mike Ferris was down here all the time. We were always in court. We sat through a Supreme Court hearing. We sat through other cases. And it just gave John, my middle one, a real heart for justice, a real heart for the law, and a real heart for public policy. And so he later went to law school, came back home. He was in law school in Virginia, and came back home and just decided he really wanted to go to work in state government. So he was with the housing authority for a while, and he loved that. And then in 19, no, it was 20, probably 2022, 23, 3 or 4 years ago, he got a call from the state superintendent of education. She had just been elected, and she asked John to be chief legal counsel for the State Department of Education. And it was like this 40-year redemptive story row. John asked me to come up and see the offices after one of our Capitol days. And, I hadn't been up there. I mean, I had been to the State Department of Education plenty, and to the legislature plenty, but I hadn't been in that office since Charlie Williams threatened me with jail. And now it was Dr. Weaver's office. So he said, "I got permission for you to be here, Mom, but I want you to come in and I want you to sit here and remember this is where you were sitting." Because it takes a long time for bureaucracies to change. This is where you were sitting when Dr. Williams threatened you with jail. And, all of a sudden, all the smells and the sounds and the memories, I can't explain it, just came flooding back over me in that minute. And I mean, I was just overwhelmed. And John just, it was his counterpart that kept me tied up in court for so long. And he said, "Mom, I remember calling Mike Ferris when John told me about this, and I couldn't tell anybody else. And Mike said, "Zan, what do you do when your enemy becomes your friend?" It just, it's just such a sweet redemptive story from the Lord. And then John says to me a few weeks later, "Hey, I've got somebody I want you to meet." So he took me to lunch and he said, "Mom, this is Tony Catone. He's the new chief legal counsel for the Department of Social Services." He was also a homeschooling dad. And so DSS, the two lawyers that had made my life so hard, not just my life, but homeschoolers' lives in general, were now occupied by homeschool dads. It's just amazing. But it is a 40-year story. It's not a 5-year story.
Yeah.
You know?
And only God can write those stories. And the reason I try to pull that out of you for you to share is because there are times when there are moms who, we call it in the trenches or in the weeds, when we're in the day to day and we can't see beyond the test that didn't look the way we expected it to look. We can't see behind the loads of curriculum. So when I hear your story of saying, Bro, we didn't get through that worksheet. I was concerned about them academically, but I had to fight for my life, like literally fight for my life. When I hear you say that, it's just so encouraging. And I can imagine anyone listening just thinking, God, you are in everything. So even when it feels like, I can't see beyond today, I can't see beyond next week, He has this beautiful story. So here you are taking your children to the courthouse day after day after day, and then one of them ends up in the courthouse making justice happen. That is just a God story that you can't make up.
Yeah, that's right. That is so true, Ro. And one thing I guess one thing I'd like to say is I heard Ray Vanderlaan speak years ago. He is a Christian educator and a Hebrew scholar. And I mean, he really loves academics. He's also done a lot of work at Focus on the Family in terms of showing people how the Old Testament because he's studied so much overseas and he takes tours of Israel and all of that. But, he said the books we choose for our children are our curriculum. And those are important things. But the interruption God brings into our lives is his curriculum. And I think, it was this combination of what I chose for my boys, which I thought was important, but then what God brings in and superimposes on top of that to give them the life experience that makes them who they are. And it doesn't mean those interruptions are fun or pleasant, but it is part of his design and his curriculum. And I thought, this gives me hope. That gave me hope. And then you can look at back and see where God is designing this unique civics and legal course
Yeah, that's
for the
right.
kids that I could have never done.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, this story may sound a little bit extreme, but you saw me when I was like on my little knee scooter because I had just broken my bones. And, sometimes we're like, oh, I want to raise XYZ kids. And we think it's just like, okay, God, download patience. Okay, God, download, XYZ. But the empathy and the level of support and consideration that I saw from my boys when I came home from the emergency room 3 days later, there was no curriculum, nothing that I could have done to instill that
That's
in
right.
them. So obviously, I did not need to break my ankle, but in that situation, God was able to pull something good out of it? So just
That's
like
right. He made them servants,
he did,
in
he
a
did.
way that nothing else could.
Yeah,
That's so sweet.
absolutely. So I love how you're saying we may have, everything planned out. Day one, we're doing this. Lesson three, 5 questions. And these, like you said, these interruptions, those are the ones that are forming the child. So it just gives us hope to remember it may not look how we want it to look. We may not understand, but we have to trust that on the other end, it's redemption. So thank you for sharing that, Zan.
Amen. Well, thank you, Ro.
My pleasure. So we're in this amazing pier. Like I know for New Jersey, it's so exciting because we're host like 20 minutes from my house. The World Cup is being played. Like this is historic, right?
Oh, isn't that so exciting? Yes,
Right. And
yes,
then right across over in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, we have so much history as we're thinking about 250 years, right? So the question
yes.
I have for you is, as you think about the history of the country and all you've been through with your homeschool journey and what you're seeing today, what would you say are some of the cultural battles and maybe even some of the legal or educational battles that are taking place behind the scenes?
That's a really good question. I think one thing is we have got to be very intentional about teaching our children the history of the United States, the principles of freedom that this country was built on, because we're in danger of losing those if we're not passing that baton to our children, because there's so much curriculum out there that doesn't teach a Christian foundation, doesn't want to admit that our founding documents were built upon biblical principles in the Declaration and in the Constitution. And I think all of that is really important. So I have my little cheat sheet where I have quotes and where I have Supreme Court decisions, and I really carry this with me everywhere I go. It's kind of funny. But there's two things. Harvard Rules and Precepts from 1646. It was founded in 1636, says, "Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well. The main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning." I mean, that was Harvard. 90% of our colleges were founded on Christian principles. And so I think we have the opportunity as Christians to give our kids an innovative education while we implement those principles of laying Christ as the foundation. And Christ is the author of freedom. Freedom in just our good idea. Christ is the author of freedom. So I think we need to be very intentional in doing that. I mean, I encourage moms to take like the what I call the 3-minute freedom challenge. 3 minutes a day, talk about freedom. Even if your children are young, just put on a timer, read the Declaration of Independence for 3 minutes until you get to the end of it. You're introducing your children to the language and the concepts of freedom. Then read the Constitution. And if you do that over and over and over, it becomes part of their psyche in some ways, or pray for people who don't have freedom. Pray for people who are dying for the right to have a legitimate vote in other countries. There's so many little ways we can keep freedom in the forefront in the conversation of our homes without it being this huge burden.
Challenge accepted. I'm going to take that 3-minute challenge because you're right. It doesn't have to be a 45-minute curriculum with 10 worksheets after. It's the dinner table conversation.
Yes.
It's we're jumping in the car, right? Or we see something because I can attest to the fact that because a lot of people in my generation did not have to fight for freedom, whether it's, something historical, whether it's homeschool, whatever it is, we take it for granted. And you see it. You see
Yes.
the times when maybe there is a legislative proposal and it's just the shrug of the shoulder. And I don't think it's always apathy. I think sometimes it's ignorance. People don't understand the importance of fighting for it because they never had to. It was just given to them.
Oh, that's right. Well, it's just like after I was threatened with jail, I woke up the next morning and the day before I was free. But did I appreciate being free the day before?
That's right.
No, I didn't. I took it totally for granted.
Yeah.
And then you don't know what you have till it's gone
Yeah.
sometimes.
Or
And
being
so,
threatened. Yeah.
yeah, so we don't want to wait for our freedom to be gone before we have that impetus, not only to train ourselves, but to train our children.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're so right. Because even when I think of it from a cultural standpoint, if you don't know the history of your country, or you don't even know maybe your family history, there's so many decisions that can be made without a thought because you don't realize what
Yes.
everyone else either went through or tried to instill in you. And I think that's why a lot of these curriculum in public schools are so watered down because if you don't know it, then you can't use the information, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I agree. Totally.
So thinking through the challenges, like what do you see on the horizon for homeschoolers in terms of what role should we play? Because you were there fighting for your freedom alone, and now we have all these organizations. We have you, we have your story, we have organizations, state organizations, co-ops, communities. With all that we have at our hands, what challenges do you see, and what is our role as parents?
Well, and I want to be clear on this too. As we marched through the 80s and early 90s, we began to build a really strong grassroots community. So it might not have been huge, but it was strong. And so I certainly didn't do the whole thing by myself, but I know what you're talking about. Apathy, like you said, or ignorance is one of them. We have got to join our state organizations. We've got to be aware of what's happening legislatively in our states and other states, because you may have a free state, but what's happening in your neighbor state is going to come to a theater near you. I mean, at some
Mhm.
point, not doing this together. One of the things that I think that's happening in our country today that is so dangerous is this narrative all of a sudden that parents are guilty until proven innocent. And always, I mean, this is so I started carrying Supreme Court decisions with me in my purse. Actually, it's just one, Pierce versus the Society of Sisters, when I was a young mom. And because I would have so many people ask me questions, and I would say, let me tell you what the Supreme Court said. And I can remember I was speaking at this forum for leaders in South Carolina. It was a young leader forum, and then they had an educational day, and I was the spokesman for homeschooling that day. They had asked me to come and speak about homeschooling. And one woman asked me, don't you feel guilty for homeschooling? And I said, well, I felt a lot of emotions over homeschooling, but tell me why I should feel guilty. And she said, well, she said, first, you're robbing the school district of the money they should be getting for your kids sitting in that seat. And then she said, you're robbing the school district of involved parents, which we need. And you're probably robbing the school district of good test scores that your boys would have because we know they're going to do well. And I looked at her. I mean, I was so shocked. And I looked at her and I said, who do you think my kids belong to anyway?
Mm.
Dead silence row. So I picked up my little sheet of paper, which has expanded now from Pierce to other things, and I said, let me read you this. The fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public school only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. And she looked at me and she said, well, where did you get that? And it was like, where did you get that right wing propaganda? And you have to remember, this is the 90s. And I said, well, from the United States Supreme Court, Pierce versus the Society of Sisters. And so I've seen this. It really dawned on me then that we live in a culture that doesn't understand that our children belong to us. Now, we know they belong to God, but for legal intents and purposes, they belong to us, not the state. Well, that has just increased and increased and increased, where more and more people either don't know that or don't want to accept that our children don't belong to the state. And now it's gotten to the point where the narrative is, and parents are guilty until proven innocent. So we have like the law that passed in Connecticut that says if you're a new homeschooler that's pulled your kids out of the public school, you have to go through this vetting by DCF, whatever their Child Protective Services organization. And you don't have to you can have a neighbor call in and say, she's homeschooling and I don't like it and I think you should investigate. There doesn't have to be any foundational truth to allegations, and then you're held up and you can't homeschool until this is cleared. And let's say now 1,000 parents have rumors told to Child Investigative Services about them. How long is it going to take them to clear that? And so I just have to read you two more things because this is so important. There was a Supreme Court decision in 1979, Parham versus JR. This is so powerful. The statist notion that governmental power should supersede parental authority in all cases because some parents abuse and neglect their children is repugnant to American tradition. And then in 2025, with Mahmoud versus Taylor, Alito wrote, we reject this chilling vision of the power of the state to strip away the critical right of parents guide the religious development of their children. So we have these bookends, 1925 with Pierce, 2025 with Mahmoud versus Taylor, and then Parham in between that really reinforces the authority of parental rights in the lives of their children. But the narrative we're hearing is parents are guilty now until proven innocent. We don't know what child abuse could be occurring there. Well, we don't know that about any home, but our tradition has always been that parents are innocent. But now we're seeing more and more legislatures move toward this concept that parents are guilty until proven innocent. And so every parent needs to be vetted. You had something like that in New Jersey, rear its ugly head.
We did. And 2025 was very interesting because, as you know, in June, a lot of us had to go to the State House to testify on a bill that was mostly about notification. Thankfully, the bill was pulled from the agenda, but that didn't stop any other bills from coming forward. And as you also know, Zan, because I sent you a text message, Late December, I was talking to Scott Woodward from HSLDA, and I said, it's December 19th, 20th, Christmas is coming. I think we're good. December 31st, New Year's Eve, a bill snuck in. And obviously, when we changed guards in 2026, all those shell bills just came over. So we still have the same bills. But, it's really egregious to just think that parents are guilty just because of their decision to homeschool. It's actually quite ridiculous to think that parents are homeschooling just to hide and harm their children. Like, what society do we live in?
I know. I know. And, there are none of us that want homeschooling to be this shelter for
Right,
abuse or
right.
educational
Of course
neglect.
not.
And that's why there are laws on the book already to prevent that.
Right.
And so it's not that we are for child abuse, which is the
Absolutely
way
not.
it's painted
Yeah,
sometimes, but we know that there are already laws on the book to take care of that, and it is American tradition that parents love their children and have the right to direct their education.
that's right. So, Zan, with all that you talked about, we talked about some of the cultural battles, some of the legal battles that you're very, very familiar with, and even the educational battles of not being taught history well. What gives you hope? Like, what are the opportunities? There's so many things happening. If you look at the media, you can go into like a deep, dark depression, and that's not our goal. So, on the flip side, what opportunities do we have, and what gives you hope today?
Well, I think God is our hope. When I saw this reel pass through on my phone, 2 reels yesterday, and I wasn't quick enough to really I was doing other things, so I wasn't paying attention, but Heidi was interviewing somebody who said used the statistic, like, something like 19% of colonists were really committed to the American Revolution or the War for Independence when we first began. And, that's hopeful. And I don't know what point that was because, like I say, this flipped through. But I do know from all my studies in history that it took a lot of work for people who were in favor of declaring their independence to bring the rest of the country along with them. I mean, there was and even up until the Constitutional Convention, there's conflict. And so this was not, let's everybody rise up together and assert our independence. It was not only a fight with the British, it was a long journey with the colonists to bring everybody on board. So I think we need to remember that. And I go back to the victories we've won with Homeschool Freedom that Mike Ferris, HSLDA, has won. And Mike is the first person to say this. If God weren't on our side, we wouldn't have won none of those victories. We've never had the majority.
Yeah.
You know, we but we've had God. And I think, fasting and prayer was such an important part of our legislative process. And as a homeschooling community, there were times, especially one time in particular, we sent out a postcard to people and said, please fast for 3 days
Wow.
and fast and pray. And some people could, some people couldn't because of being pregnant. But, it was a community wide thing. Let's devote ourselves for 3 days to this for fasting and prayer for this hearing. And I just think we just see God do remarkable things. I don't know if you've seen the new movie. Is it The Awakening? It's the one about George Whitfield and Benjamin
Not
Franklin.
yet.
And I was reading something else the other day that said we've had great preachers in 3 generations. First we had George Whitfield, then we had Charles Spurgeon, then we had Billy Graham. And it's like God is always going to send, and we need to pray that God is always going to send his messenger and his word with power and force. There's a verse in Amos, I think, that talks about there was a oh, what was the word they used? There was just a void of the word of God. The word of God, it was like it wasn't even present. And in comes Christ. It just, we've always in this world, we're going to always have conflict and we're going to always have challenges, but we always have the hope of God, I think, and the hope of the gospel. And
Amen.
now we have communities. We have communities like you've developed in New Jersey and CHAP and organizations in South Carolina, and I love my work with BJU Press Homeschool. That is a curriculum that's not only robust educationally, but so true to God's word. So we have resources and communities that are committed to this, and we just need to rise up together
I
and
love
be
that.
strong, you know.
Yes. Thank you so much, Zan. Any final thoughts? Anything you want to share?
Okay, I have one more quote, and
Sure.
it's not, I mean, it's not an obscure quote, but it's a powerful quote. And this is from Ronald Reagan. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We
Mm.
didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free. I read that every day, and I remind myself, this is now for my children's children, and we can't afford not to care or to be lazy or to be tired.
Mm. That was good. That was a perfect ending. Dan, thank
Thank
you
you.
so, so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for your courage. Because, like you said, it's not the absence of fear. The fear is there, but you feel the fear and you do it anyways. So, I just want to thank you on behalf of the homeschool community, on behalf of moms everywhere. Thank you for the fight in you. Thank you for trusting God through the situation. And thank you for continuing to serve because a lot of people get to the other side and be like, bye, but you stayed with us. And we're so thankful for everything you've done for us. Thank you, Zan.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Ro. I appreciate it.